It was a calm afternoon on the eve of Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971. An elderly-looking man walked into the Portland International Airport. He most likely wouldn't have grabbed your attention. He possessed a light olive complexion, was around 6 feet tall, had brown eyes, black hair, and was wearing a dark business suit and tie. He seemed to be in his mid-40s and was carrying a black attaché case. Just a completely normal businessman if you ask me. Around him, the airport was alive with chatter and people rushing around trying to catch their flights. Many are, most likely, traveling for Thanksgiving to be with their loved ones, perhaps to enjoy a meal of turkey or stuffing or simply to catch up with family and friends. But not this man. This man in black isn't here to be grateful for what he has or to rejoice with loved ones. No, he is in the pursuit of something far more material. He approached the flight counter of Northwest Orient Airlines and purchased a one-way $20 ticket for Flight 305 that departs from Portland and goes to his destination at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The price of the ticket was equivalent to $147 today in 2023, a large amount for a simple 30-minute flight between Portland and Seattle. At the counter, the man in black would write down Dan Cooper as his name, a name that we now know to be a pseudonym. No ID was shown or requested, and there was no need to prove who you were. This was the practice back then. This was the pre-9/11 security measures. He would board the plane and take his seat at 18E and order a drink of bourbon, 7-Up, and have a smoke. A true man of culture. Though storm clouds were forming above, the flight would depart from Portland with no issue. No indication of what was to come. A simple 30-minute flight between Portland and Seattle that would eventually turn into a lifetime of trauma and mystery. The flight would depart at 2:50 p.m. on schedule with 37 passengers and a crew of 6. This would include Captain William Scott, First Officer Bob Radazak, Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson, and 3 flight attendants, Tina Mucklow, Florence Schaffner, and Alice Hancock. They would be traveling on the Boeing 727, a trijet that could hold upwards of 129 passengers. The 727 was popular for short domestic flights with fewer passengers. Unlike larger planes, it could fly at slower speeds and lower altitudes without stalling, a fact that Cooper was well aware of and one that he would take full advantage of. With his drink and quick smoke, his nerves most likely would have been settled down, and at this point, slightly after 3 p.m., D.B. Cooper would spring into action and begin his plan. One of the flight attendants, Florence Schaffner, was passing by Cooper, and Cooper would signal over to her and hand her a closed note. Schaffner, believing that the note was most likely a lonely businessman trying to give her his number or inviting her to his hotel, decided to ignore the note and drop it into her purse, unopened, and carry on with their business. This interpretation would have not been unwarranted. Believe it or not, it was common for men traveling alone to proposition female flight attendants like this. Schaffner was young and beautiful, and most likely would have had commonly dealt with this sort of stuff. However, this was no normal pickup attempt. It was a ransom note, one of which, if not fulfilled, may result in the plane never reaching Seattle. When Schaffner would pass by Cooper again, he would signal to her to come closer and would tell her quite bluntly, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." Schaffner would walk over to the galley and read the note. On the note, Cooper had written a short message. "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase, and I want you to sit by me." Schaffner, though in shock, would comply and sit next to Cooper. Upon sitting next to him, Schaffner would ask Cooper to see the bomb, perhaps believing that this might be a hoax or a sick joke. Cooper would comply with their request and open his briefcase. According to Schaffner, she would recall seeing a set of wires, 2 rows of 4 red cylinders that appeared to look like dynamite. Schaffner still couldn't be sure that his bomb was real, but of course was in no position to deny it or confirm it, and had to assume that it was real in order to protect herself and the passengers on the plane. Now, just wait a minute. You might think to yourself, a briefcase filled with cylinders and wires, smoking on a plane, writing down fake names, not being searched or anything. I mean, today you get busted for trying to bring a water bottle onto a plane. Well, you see, ladies and gentlemen, this was the early 1970s. The golden era of flying. This was before the high security measures that were brought in after 9/11. Back then, most airports didn't even have metal detectors. And hey, you want to turn the plane into a hot box and smoke a pack of cigarettes? Well, go right ahead. A truly more enlightened and libertine age. Of course, now you gotta wait hours in a security line and have all your items checked and deal with TSA agents that might hate you more than they hate their own lives. But the interesting thing is that back then, it's not like the government had no reason to increase security. Airplane hijackings weren't exactly rare this time. I mean, just in 1971, there had been multiple high-profile hijacking. Japanese airline Flight 351 was hijacked by Japanese-born North Korean extremists. Eastern Airlines flight going from New York to Boston had been hijacked at gunpoint and the pilot had even been shot. And just 2 months before the Cooper hijacking, you had the Dawson Field hijackings, in which members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine would hijack 4 airliners, land them on an airstrip in the desert of Jordan near Zakwa, Jordan, and then blow them up on the runway. But despite these events, changes would come slowly to the airline industry. Hijackings back then were just treated as a normal part of the business. In fact, most airlines even had policies of total compliance with hijackers. It wouldn't really be until the terrible acts of September 11, 2001 that significant changes would come. But of course, I'm going on a tangent, and we should probably return back to the story. Cooper would eventually close his briefcase and list his demands to Schaffner, who would then record them on a note. His demands were simple. He wanted $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. He wanted the money in US dollars and $20 bills. The note also included the phrase, "No funny business." And I guess we can guess if there was funny business, well, Cooper might have put that briefcase into action. Now, why would Cooper want $20 bills? I guess it could be made that larger bills like 50s or 100s might be harder to spend and might make you seem a little more suspicious if you were just whipping them out. Of course, if the bills were smaller, $10, $5, $1, he would need way more of them, which would most likely result in a heavier weight and make it a little bit harder for him to run away. But of course, with $20 bills, he would only need 10,000 of them, which would be a total of 21 pounds, a very manageable amount. Whatever the reason, this is how it would be. Now you might think that $200,000 is nothing to get into all this trouble over such a measly amount, but it's important to remember that $200,000 in 1971 is the equivalent of $1.47 million today, an inflationary rate of 633%. And today we think that 8 to 10% of the post-COVID inflation is bad, but of course, it's been much worse before, especially during the 1970s. And of course, as we know, the US government has used inflation for a long time as a hidden tax to rob you of your wealth or enrich their donors with the help of the Federal Reserve. Oh, sorry, I probably shouldn't be getting into that. Schaffner would carry this note into the cockpit and inform the captain. Captain Scott would then contact the Seattle Air Traffic Control, who would then get into contact with the Seattle Police and FBI. The FBI, of course, not wanting Cooper to act irrationally, would actually advise the president of Northwest Orient Airlines, Donald Nitrop, to comply with the demands of the hijacker. Nitrop would authorize the payment of the ransom, and the FBI and the local police would work together to collect the money in parachutes. Schaffner herself would remain in the cockpit, and another flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, would spend the rest of the time with Cooper until his very final moments on the plane. Cooper would further make additional demands before reaching Seattle. He wanted fuel trucks to meet him at the airport upon landing and to immediately refuel the plane. He also wanted all passengers to remain seated until the money and parachutes were brought aboard. While the money and items were assembled, the plane would circle the Seattle-Tacoma area for almost 2 whole hours. While all this was being done, the demands were being met, the money and items were being assembled, the plane itself would actually circle the Seattle-Tacoma area for almost 2 hours, not landing until the items were ready to go. And of course, this would end up resulting in a simple 30-minute flight turning into a 2-hour ordeal. And I know a lot of people would probably get mad if you just had a 1-hour delay, but a 2-hour delay on just a 30-minute flight, I think you could see that things might have been getting a little heated in the cockpit. Of course, the passengers were still unaware of the hijack. The pilot had obviously not revealed the exact details, but instead had come out with an excuse saying that the landing was due to a mechanical issue. The passengers would go the entire flight without ever knowing there was a hijacking, which itself is the weirdest part of this hijacking. Because when you think of hijackers, you imagine a group of bandit-clad gunmen yelling orders, creating chaos, but this wasn't what DB Cooper was doing. He was perhaps one of the most cool-headed and smooth hijackers out there, one who managed to hijack the entire plane with most on board never even noticing. Complete stealth hijacker in a sense. Tina Mucklow, who would spend the most time with Cooper, would note that Cooper was not nervous. He seemed rather nice and was not cruel or nasty. Mucklow herself would actually sit by Cooper for the rest of the flight after Schaffner had gone to the cockpit. She herself would actually engage in further conversations with Cooper, trying to keep him, hopefully, in a good mood, hoping he doesn't do anything rash. She would ask him why he decided to hijack the plane. Cooper would interestingly respond, "It's not because I have a grudge against your airlines, it's just that I have a grudge." A strange response. Highly unlikely someone will hijack a plane over a grudge, but perhaps he was mad at the world and thought by taking this $200,000, he was getting something back. Cooper would ask where Mucklow was from, and she would respond Minneapolis. Cooper remarked that Minnesota was good country. Though when Mucklow asked Cooper where he was from, well, Cooper wouldn't like that and would refuse to answer. Overall, Cooper seemed like a respectful and mostly well-mannered man. I mean, if you look at his picture, you would imagine him to be selling insurance, not threatening to blow you up, not one you would think to commit such a crime. A fact that just adds even more mystery to this entire affair. During this time, Tina would be approached by other passengers asking about the delay and when the plane would land. Many of them surely would have been quite upset with their 30-minute flight turning into 2 hours. Nevertheless, Tina had to keep on an act to avoid chaos and potentially instigating Cooper. At this point, Schaffner and most of the crew were in the cockpit. Tina most likely would have been the only one in the cabin with the knowledge of what was truly going on. Quite a frightening situation. Imagine being surrounded by people that are resting in ignorant bliss, while you're the only one that's truly aware of the horror that is sitting right next to everyone. Tina herself would remark that she was there for the hijacker, to kind of keep him feeling safe, reassured, comfortable, and most importantly, not detonating that bomb. I suppose keeping everyone in ignorance was truly in their best interest. Tina would spend the rest of the flight to Seattle, relaying messages between Cooper and the cockpit. While all this was happening, the FBI and the Seattle police would be traveling between multiple banks, assembling the ransom money. They would try to acquire parachutes from multiple sources. They originally planned to get parachutes from the local Air Force base. However, Cooper would reject the idea of military chutes, as he wanted civilian ones. This was due to military chutes not having ripcords, and therefore the diver could not control when to deploy the chute. Officials were assuming that Cooper was going to jump from the plane. They had originally planned to give Cooper dummy chutes. However, since Cooper was requesting multiple chutes, they believed that he might take a hostage as well. Therefore, they decided to provide real parachutes and not risk any civilian life. Eventually, around 5:24 p.m., Captain Scott would be notified by the air traffic control that the parachutes and money had been assembled. Scott would then notify Cooper and bring the plane in for a landing. And at 5:46 p.m., Flight 305 would finally land after a 2-hour delay, and the next stage of Cooper's plan would be sprung into motion. Once the plane landed in Seattle, per Cooper's demands, the plane would taxi over and stop on a partially lit section of the runway, away from the terminal. Cooper didn't want vehicles, besides the fuel trucks, to come near the plane. He only allowed one person to bring the requested items to the plane. Of course, not police or anyone official would be allowed nearby. People would only enter and leave the plane from the front door. The individual bringing the items would leave them outside, and Tina would go outside and bring the items back. The chosen mule in this case would be named Al Lee, the operations manager at Northwest Orient Airlines. Lee would not wear the company uniform, afraid that Cooper might mistake him for law enforcement or any other sort of official. He would go up to the plane and drop off the money in parachutes. And at this moment, Tina would venture outside and retrieve the ransom money in parachutes. She would carry the items past the other passengers and bring them to Cooper. I do wonder what the passengers may have been thinking during this time. The plane is delayed for 2 hours, then is parked on a partially lit part of the runway, and then the flight attendant is dragging in parachutes and a large bag. Surely someone should have been suspicious at this point, but it doesn't seem like anyone said or did anything. Perhaps those that were suspicious decided it was better to say and do nothing. However, those passengers that may have been somewhat aware or suspicious wouldn't need to worry long, as Cooper would soon release the passengers after confirming the money and parachutes were there and accounted for. As Cooper was going through the money, Tina would joke if she could have a portion of the take. As cool as always, Cooper would hand her an entire packet of bills. However, due to personal morality concerns and probably not wanting to be an unnecessary accessory to air piracy, she would reject the offer and return the money, ultimately citing her company's policy against receiving gratuities as the official excuse. After the passengers had departed, flight attendants were anxious to join them. Alice Hancock, the third flight attendant, and absent until now, would request permission from Cooper to depart the plane. Cooper, sly as always, perhaps due to the bourbon and tobacco, would remark, "Whatever you girls would like." Before departing, Florence Schaffner would request to receive her purse from behind Cooper, and to this Cooper would simply reply, "I won't bite." Cooper Banai would have been quite pleased with himself. He had the money, the escape path. All he needed now was for the plane to get back in the air. While Alice and Florence would depart the plane, the journey was not over for Tina, and Cooper would have her accompanying him for the rest of the flight. Now that the money had been acquired, Cooper would now issue new demands. He wanted the plane to fully refuel before departing, and then fly straight to Mexico City. He wanted the plane to fly at or below 10,000 feet and at less than 100 knots, which is 185 kilometers per hour or about 115 miles per hour. Cooper also demanded that the landing gear should remain deployed and that the wing flaps should be lowered to 15 degrees. Cooper wanted the cabin to be depressurized most likely to avoid a gush of air rushing out once he opened the rear stairs. He also wanted the rear stairs to remain extended as the plane lifted off the ground, and to remain this way during the flight. However, here's where Cooper would receive the first pushback, and would be for the first time that he would have to compromise and make concessions. The management at Northwest Orient Airlines believed that leaving the rear stairs open during takeoff would be far too dangerous. The first officer would also tell Cooper that the plane would have to refuel in Reno and couldn't make the journey straight to Mexico City due to the altitude and speed requirements. Cooper, most likely against his desires, would have to agree to close the rear staircase and to make the pit stop at Reno before going to Mexico City, his final destination. However, before worrying about refueling in Reno, Cooper would have to worry about refueling in Seattle. Perhaps due to mechanical problems or delaying tactics by the authorities, the refueling was taking longer than usual. For the first time, the normally cool Cooper would become visibly frustrated and comment, "This shouldn't be taking so long," and would also remark, "Let's get this show on the road." Perhaps the bourbon was finally wearing off and the stress of the situation was getting to him. Or maybe now that the FBI and other government agencies were aware of his plans, he would certainly be in quite a rush to get out of there. Eventually, up to 3 trucks would have to be brought up to finish the refueling. Before departing, an FAA official would request an audience with Cooper, perhaps to tell him how he was breaking the law and being a terrible person and the consequences and whatnot, and maybe how he could still change his mind and do the right thing or something. Of course, at this point, Cooper had well crossed the Rubicon, and there was no going back. The money was literally in the bag, and the only way forward was Mexico. With 3 in the cockpit and Tina Mucklow by his side, Cooper would depart for what would become his last flight. After 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 would depart from Seattle and follow the flight specifications given out by Cooper. However, the plane wouldn't leave alone. The Air Force would scramble 2 F-106 fighters to shadow him. By now, the night had become stormy with rain, high winds, and even lightning, a fitting match to the situation inside the plane. As the storm rumbled outside, Tina was now truly alone with Cooper in the cabin. The passengers and her fellow flight attendants were gone, and the cockpit crew were separated by a door and the entire first class. According to an interview she did with the Rolling Stones in 2021, she would remark, "I think the one feeling that was at the forefront in my mind was just that I felt so alone." Not long into the flight, about 25 miles north of Portland near Mount St. Helens, Cooper would decide that, you know what, he wasn't going to go to Mexico. Instead, he would have a change of plans. Instead of continuing the flight to Reno, Cooper would make an early stop and perhaps carry on with the journey himself, alone. Cooper ordered Tina to lower the aft staircase. Though Tina would prove to be uncooperative, reasonably, she was concerned for her safety. She feared being sucked out of the plane into the dark and stormy night, becoming a victim of a strange man's greed. The pilots would suggest that she come into the cockpit and retrieve an emergency rope and use it as a harness. Cooper, however, would reject this idea. He didn't really want Tina going into the cockpit, and didn't want the pilots coming out. He would certainly be afraid of them collaborating to act against him. He was outnumbered after all, and fear was his force multiplier. Fear works best when your victims are alone. Mucklow wouldn't budge on her hesitation and would refuse to open the staircase. She asked Cooper to make her harness out of the parachute cord wire. I don't blame her for her hesitation. She had to sit next to Cooper and his bomb for hours, and now was alone in the cabin with a potential madman. She had only recently been hired and was only 22 years old, had her whole life ahead of her, and she probably wasn't being paid enough to risk her life further for this nonsense. Cooper would grow impatient and would decide to just do it himself. Cooper ordered Mucklow to leave the cabin and head for the cockpit. He would no longer have any need of her. However, before leaving, she would plead with Cooper to take the bomb with him. Cooper would assure her that he would either take the bomb or disarm it. As she departed, she would close the cabin curtains, the ones that separate coach and first class behind her. As she closed the curtains, she would catch the last glimpse of Cooper as he stood in the aisle, attempting to do what seemed like tying money bags around his waist. This is the last time anyone would, at least to our knowledge, lay eyes on Cooper. With Cooper behind her, Mucklow would enter the cockpit and lock the door behind her. Her nightmare, as she would have hoped, would soon be at an end. Per the Rolling Stones interview, upon entering the cockpit, Tina felt that being able to reunite with the rest of my crew coming through the cockpit was an amazing experience, and that we were still in harm's way, but I wasn't alone. All of us looked at each other, and there was just a sense of amazement. After 8 p.m., a red light would come on in the cockpit to indicate that the aft staircase had been opened. Captain Scott would use the intercom to inquire whether Cooper needed any additional help. Cooper would bluntly reply, no. These were the last words of Cooper the flight crew would hear. And just like that, Cooper would then jump from the plane into the dark and stormy void. I say no was his last word, and I say this because Cooper didn't just fall from the plane. He fell from the face of the earth. His face and voice would never be heard or seen again, at least not by anyone that had seen him on the plane. Cooper went as he came, a mysterious man from the void, a man that would leave his mark on the world, but would conceal his very existence. Afterward, the flight crew would remain in the cockpit, afraid of what Cooper might do if he was still in the cabin. They weren't sure that Cooper had jumped, as there were no security cameras. As they approached Reno, Mucklow would use the intercom to notify Cooper that they were approaching the airport. She, of course, would hear no response. At 11:02 p.m., Flight 305 would finally land in Reno. The captain, upon landing, would search the cabin and learn that Cooper was gone. The FBI and members of the local and state police would form a perimeter around the aircraft after it landed. And furthermore, an FBI bomb squad would search the plane and confirm that the cabin was safe. And the bomb, and more importantly Cooper, wasn't present. Afterward, the FBI would launch one of their biggest and most exhaustive investigations in history. The investigation would be known as NORJAC, otherwise known as the Northwest hijackings. No one knew exactly when Cooper jumped, and the F-106 fighter jets that were following the plane wouldn't see anyone jump either. Though it is assumed that he jumped near Ariel, Washington, due to the timing of when the aircraft staircase was opened, the aircraft that were following him, the F-106 fighters, would have had a lot of trouble traveling at such low speeds and heights. The stormy weather prevented the police from launching any sort of a large-scale search over the grounds, and once the search could take place, nothing would be found, not Cooper, or the money, or the parachutes. Charges of piracy would be filed in 1976, but no name could truly be attached to them. After almost an entire decade of bad leads, evidence that really didn't go anywhere, they would finally get a pretty big break in 1980. See, in 1980, an 8-year-old boy would discover an entire bundle of money, $5,800, lying by the Columbia River, in the same area as where Cooper is believed to have jumped. What's interesting is that this money had the same serial numbers as the ransom money that had been handed out, so it was, for all intents and purposes, part of the ransom money and connected to Cooper. Unfortunately, they wouldn't really find anything else nearby. And, furthermore, Mount St. Helens would, a few months later, in 1980, erupt and completely cover the entire search area, potentially destroying whatever evidence remained. Seems even Mount St. Helens wanted to continue this mystery. Of course, the most important question that has persisted is, who was Cooper? Was he just some ordinary civilian that was desperate for money? Did he just want to rush, or was he a highly trained former member of the military or another government agency? These are all theories that have been brought up, and many people have been debating for a long time. Unfortunately, Cooper didn't leave any smoking gun behind. The FBI would discover 66 fingerprints, a black clip-on tie, cigarette butts, and the 2 of the 4 parachutes. However, the fingerprints and DNA samples on the tie and cigarette, unfortunately, wouldn't bring the FBI closer to his true identity. The FBI did originally think that the Cooper may have served as a paratrooper in the military, as they believed that Cooper must have been an experienced skydiver to dive off in the conditions that he did. Also, his knowledge of local military bases near Seattle also seemed to back up the claim that he might have been a previous military member. However, the FBI would soon drop this line of thinking. The FBI would eventually change their tone and start to believe that Cooper was not an experienced skydiver. The jump was simply too dangerous, not a jump that any experienced skydiver would ever engage in. The altitude was low, it was dark and windy, and the weather wasn't ideal. It was cold, raining, below freezing actually, with wind speeds as high as 322 kilometers per hour or 200 miles per hour at that height. An experienced skydiver would have never made a jump in these conditions. In addition, Cooper was wearing a business suit and shoes. He didn't even have a proper equipment, and neither did he ask for it. He also didn't seem to notice that the reserve chutes were sewn shut and therefore could not operate. The parachute that he used couldn't be steered, and he also happened to jump over a wooded area. All these conditions make a jump that would be difficult even for the most experienced skydivers with the proper equipment. However, despite this, Cooper was clearly no novice, or a man that had just spontaneously went on a plane. It was quite obvious that he had planned this and had knowledge about aviation above that of the average person. Cooper strategically chose a spot at the end of the plane. He wouldn't have to worry about others in the cabin, he could keep an eye on them, and not have to worry about watching his rear. And he was able to hide himself from most of the passengers. In addition, his use of a bomb prevented the FBI from rushing the plane and attacking it. The bomb allowed him to pose a threat to the entire plane. Simply shooting it wouldn't have been enough, because if the bomb was armed, it could have still gone off and killed a lot of people. Cooper also tried to reduce the amount of evidence left behind. He demanded that all his notes be returned and even prevented Tina from disposing of a matchbook that he had been using to light his cigarettes. Cooper also knew that the 727 could fly at a low height and airspeed. He seemed familiar with the refueling time of the plane and would complain that the refueling shouldn't be taking as long as it did. He gave exact specifications for height, speed, and even the angle of the flaps. His knowledge of aircraft and aviation in general was clearly more of the average layman. Cooper also knew that the rear aft staircase could be lowered during the flight, a piece of knowledge that civilian flight crews were not informed of. The FBI ultimately concluded that Cooper could have not survived the cold and windy weather. Though his body was never found, authorities would assume that he most likely either fell into the river and drowned, or may have landed in the woods. could have been either consumed by the elements or wildlife. There will be no confirmed sightings of Cooper, and all we know about his appearance comes from FBI sketches. Both Florence and Tina were interviewed that very night, and both gave similar descriptions. The FBI would produce 3 sketches and eventually settle with a revised composite sketch B. Ultimately, neither the evidence found on the plane, the sketches, nor the bundle of money would bring anyone closer to finding Cooper. Hundreds of suspects would be interviewed, and all would be eliminated as potential subjects. These hijackings would lead to reforms in security for airlines. Metal detectors would be installed, airlines were given the power to search the belongings of passengers, and the death penalty was reinstated for hijackings. Also, changes were made to the aircraft to prevent the rear aft staircase from being lowered during the flight. The FBI would continue to maintain an active investigation until 2016, when the FBI finally shelved it. No agents or resources would be dedicated to this case unless additional evidence was to emerge. Amateur sleuths all over would spend countless hours trying themselves to find Cooper on their own, but would end up being just as unsuccessful as the FBI. Clubs and entire followings of Cooper fans have emerged, and drinks have been named in its honor. There's even entire conventions for the man. The man has become a spectacle and remains ever present in our current lives today. Netflix documentaries, YouTube videos abound everywhere. So, to conclude this long video, I will let you know what I believe to be the fate of Cooper. I believe that Cooper probably died after his jump. His body was destroyed due to the elements or eaten alive by animals. I mean, after all, he jumped from 10,000 feet during the night in a storm. The temperature was below freezing at that height. He didn't have proper clothing. The cold, combined with the rain, would have most likely led to hypothermia. I think Cooper probably would have frozen up and landed on the ground, potentially breaking bones or even dying upon impact. Also, the money has never been found, meaning that it has never been spent, nor sightings or evidence of that money. It seems like someone that just departed from the earth. I can't really back up my thoughts with any conclusive evidence. In fact, no one making any sort of claim about Cooper truly can, and it seems like that as long as the fate of Cooper remains unknown, it can be offered that Cooper survived and lived the rest of his life in peace, but it can also be Cooper that he perished that very night. Regardless, Cooper's hijacking is the only unsolved case of air piracy. What was to be a normal Thanksgiving flight turned into quite an ordeal. Regardless of his fate, he is the only one to elude the FBI and ultimately beat the law. And therefore, Cooper will remain a legend, the man who beat the law.